Let's go to the next part here as well. And this is a perfect illustration of the logical insanity that I was alluding to. It's a piece in War on the Rocks by Jeremy Shapiro called "We Are on a Path to Nuclear War." Put the inflammatory headline aside, and exactly what Shapiro talks about here, who, by the way, is a director of research at the European Council on Foreign Relations and a non-resident fellow at Brookings Institution, who also served in the State Department from 2009 to 2013. This guy is a member of the quote-unquote blob, like the foreign policy establishment. So for him to say something like this, I think carries more weight than, just the two of us who have always kind of been beating this drum. And exactly what he lays out here, Krystal, is a direct and rational way in which the world gets into a nuclear exchange in a very, very quick time frame. Specifically what he says, and this is where the onus is, of course, on Russia, which is Russia has laid out all kinds of red lines. They said that there would be a war if Finland and Sweden were going to be in NATO. Okay, that didn't happen. They said that there was going to be crazy response if we delivered anti-aircraft systems. That didn't happen. They keep saying and threatening the nuclear, beating the nuclear drum, and we keep basically doing it. And so what is the lesson? A, that the nuclear threat from Putin is probably a bluff, or maybe could be a bluff, and that the US can continue to test red lines and see what we can get away with. Now, all of that's fine as long as the consequences of breaching that red line aren't catastrophe and Armageddon for the entire planet.
Yeah.
What he points out is that eventually the ante is going to continue to be upped. Ukraine bombing that, likely bombing, okay, let's say that. Right, Ukraine likely bombing that bridge in Crimea was supposed to be a red line for nuclear war and a territorial, well, they didn't respond in nuclear. So Ukraine is going to continue to test Putin's red lines. Putin is going to continue to test the West's red lines. And the West is going to continue to ignore a lot of Putin's pronouncements and give the Ukrainians everything they want. With that, we have something called path dependency, which are two things where that's just going to keep happening. And as that goes, the path to nuclear war that Shapiro lays out here becomes ever more likely because eventually somebody's red line does actually get crossed. And you can logically explain how the insane situation of a nuclear exchange would then happen.
I really, really encourage people to read this whole piece. I sent it to a bunch of people yesterday because not only does he explain how the seemingly insane, which is, nuclear Armageddon, could happen and could begin with two, basically rational actors, but he lays out step by step what that could look like. What the Russians would do, how we would respond, how they would respond, how we would respond, and how you end up in this, potentially world-ending exchange with each step seemingly intelligent and rational along the way. And that's what's so terrifying about this. And that's also why, I appreciate Biden seems to recognize that that's the case. When he made those comments that we talked about before, which got a lot of attention in a fundraiser where he posited that we could end up in nuclear Armageddon, which, for a president to say that is quite stark. He indicated to Jake Tapper here that that was really messaging towards Putin to help him understand, because in Russia, there seems to be more thought towards, we could use these tactical nuclear weapons and it might be okay. It might be okay. They probably won't respond that fiercely. We could probably get away with it without having this escalatory cycle. And so Biden is really trying to clearly send a message to Putin, that's not the way that this thing ultimately works. So you need to think again if you're considering, following the line of the Hawks and using these tactical nuclear weapons in this conflict. I'm going to read a portion of this piece by, what was his name? Jeremy Shapiro. I want to read a portion of this because it speaks exactly to what we're saying here. He says, listen, no rational or even sane leader plans to start a nuclear war. And for all of the Russian regime's risk-taking, it does not show signs of suicidal tendencies. The essence of the problem is more insidious than mere insanity. Once an escalatory cycle begins, a series of individually rational steps can add up to a world-ending absurdity. In Ukraine, both sides have publicly pledged that they cannot lose this war. They hold that doing so would threaten their very way of life and the values they hold most dear. In the Russian case particularly, a loss in Ukraine would seem to threaten regime survival and even the territorial integrity of the country. He goes on to note that what we know so far from this conflict is ever-increasing escalation. So anytime one side feels like the other side has a bit of an edge, they escalate. And then guess what? The other side feels like, they're at risk now of losing the war. They escalate. That has been the history of this war to date. That's why he says, with the very provocative headline, we are on a path to nuclear war. Because if you continue step by step by step by step in that direction, that's exactly where you end up, as insane as that ultimately seems.
Yeah, I think that, the piece is important. It does describe the exact steps. And, ultimately, I just think that in general, and I've said this before, the reason why that most people aren't aware of this is because they're not considering the day-to-day realities on the ground. They're not listening to Putin's speech in Russian in the translation where he updates his nuclear doctrine. They're not listening to Joe Biden when he says behind closed doors that we're on the path to nuclear Armageddon. Frankly, how many people are even watching this CNN segment or even our coverage of this? The vast majority of people are like, yeah, Ukraine is good, Russia's bad, we should help them. They have no idea what the consequences and the chain of escalation will look like. And my fear is they're not gonna find out until it's way too late. And and then what say do we have? Nothing. I mean, one of the crazy things about nuclear war, there's no democratic check. Congress doesn't have to say anything. Joe Biden has sole decision-making authority.
Insane.
And so does Vladimir Putin. You would think in a representational democracy like us, actually it would require people in the chain of command committing treason and saying, no, I'm not gonna do it.
Yeah.
So do you bet on that? Because I don't. They all share the same assumptions in this war. So I could see it all happening very quickly. I mean, I've seen estimates out there, even people like Shapiro and others are saying that the risk right now of a nuclear exchange is 20 to 25%. Yeah. I don't know if it's worth, putting percentages and all of that. I would just say, the 5 seconds to midnight seems like reality to me. And that's a terrifying situation.
Yeah. I mean, it falls to President Brandon to keep us out of nuclear war.
Yeah.
And the really sad thing is we could do a lot worse. I feel a lot better with him there than I would with, Hillary Clinton
George
or
W. Bush.
Kamala Harris or George W. Bush or, even Trump, who's all over, who was extremely hawkish towards Russia, actually, when he was in office, in spite of what the media would tell you about all of that thing. I mean, friggin' Mike Pompeo was in his administration. John Bolton was in his administration. Pompeo is out there. We're going to get to this in just a minute. It's saying very escalatory, hawkish things. So, I cannot possibly say enough what a precarious situation this is, what a frightening situation it is, what a predictable situation it is that, if you escalate and escalate and escalate and escalate with nuclear power, you're going to end up in this exact scenario where it's, if 25% odds you're going to have a nuclear exchange. And that, in my opinion, might be on the low side at this point. Yeah. So it truly, truly is a terrifying state of affairs. What you were saying about the American public, I think partly it's underestimated. I mean, number one, because the media does a horrific job of explaining these risks and really laying out the risks and the consequences. I mean, Tapper, we played this out of him before, being like, that's crazy talk. To Senator Chris Murphy, why would you say this? This is ridiculous ultimately. But the other piece is, it does seem like an insane outcome. And it's been so long since we've really stared in the face of this kind of nuclear threat that I think it's hard for people to really comprehend that this is the place that we've ended up in the year 2022. But all that being said, I would take the judgment of the American people over the, elite elected officials here in Washington, because they are much, much, much more in favor of conditioning our continued support for Ukraine on some sort of a diplomatic process. So even as they've been misled and propagandized by the media, they still have the good sense to see the basic dynamic of this is not a good thing to just allow this war to continue. It should not be our government's policy that we want this war to continue. We need to find a way to bring this thing to a close for the good of absolutely everyone around the globe.
Listen, if we had an ability to have democratic check, I will always put my faith.
Oh, yeah.
What I'm saying is I don't think that we have such a check, unfortunately. Let's go to the next part here, and let's put this on the screen just to underscore how exactly this is baked in now to basically the establishment and the foreign policy elite. This was an op-ed which was written by Leon Panetta, former CIA director under Barack Obama and the former defense secretary, former White House chief of staff to Bill Clinton. Very, very tapped in figure in his own right. And probably, I think it's fair to say, probably still keeps in touch with some of his colleagues in the Biden administration, many of whom he was once the boss of. So why does any of this matter? Well, he's writing this op-ed to say clearly, quote, if Putin uses nukes in Ukraine, the U.S. must respond with military force. And actually, why I took away so important from this is not only, Krystal, the acknowledgement that the U.S. should respond, which is that the new canard from the foreign policy elite is that if a tactical nuclear weapon of any kind is used, is that the U.S. won't just respond in a nuclear fashion because as we would under NATO, since we have no obligation to defend Ukraine, but we would instead use conventional military weapons to attack the Russian military. And then they're like, well, then it's Russia's choice if they want to go to nuclear war or not. I guess you could see how rhetorically that means that you're not effectively signing the fate of tens of millions of Americans away. But the crazy thing in this piece is he acknowledges that it would be an escalation, which would likely lead to a nuclear exchange, and still says, yeah, we should just do it anyway.
That's what we should do.
So I just want people to know, like, this is the former defense secretary, Barack Obama, the guy who, in the movie played by James Gandolfini, who was like, let's go and get bin Laden. This is the guy, not necessarily known as a neocon hawk, even in his time in Washington. And this is what he's writing in Politico magazine the way that you should always interpret these things are twofold. A, it's a pressure campaign from the outside. Try to get the people on the inside in order to take your argument seriously. But sometimes it's the other way, which is that they use former officials to actually as a laundromat for their internal thinking as to what the debates are playing out. So I'm watching all of this very, very carefully. And there are two noteworthy things that have happened on this front. First and foremost was the day after the nuclear threat issued, David Petraeus, former four-star, the liberal intelligentsia kind of personified, goes on ABC News and said, absolutely, if that happens, we are taking out a conventional military response on the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Of course, the Black Sea Fleet. Of course, there's no follow-up question. Well, Ms. General, would that lead to a nuclear exchange?
Right. What happens then?
Nobody asked that. Crazy. Second is this piece. So now you have a former four-star, probably the most recognized general in modern U.S. history saying this. Second, we now have a former Secretary of Defense. So I think that we should take these very seriously. On the other hand, we already showed you that clip the other day, which took tremendous courage by Admiral Mullen, who was like, no, we need to have diplomacy. We need it now. Putin and Washington need to sit down at the table. I'm concerned about the rhetoric. So these are all, like I said, these people don't just come out of the woodwork. It's a game that is playing out in Washington in order to massage the Pentagon and
shape elite opinion.
Shape elite opinion. And right now, I think unambiguously the Hawks are winning, which is why I want people to know, like, if it happens, I am 99% sure that we will be in a full-blown world war with Russia, which will result in a nuclear exchange. I don't have any doubt about that at all. And that's why, having a real debate and understanding of the facts is incredibly important. I also want to underscore, this is totally bipartisan. So let's put this up there on the screen from Mike Pompeo. Quote, you know how we can convince Vladimir Putin to withdraw from Ukraine? Give the Ukrainians the weapons that they need to win. Why does that matter? Well, that's the former Secretary of State under Donald Trump, Krystal.
Right.
So we just showed two prominent U.S. officials. Also, by the way, he was a former CIA director, so I'm sensing a little bit of a theme here about what's exactly getting laundered in public opinion. There are two side-by-side bipartisan responses, making it clear we will not even back down, because don't even use their language. We will not go to the table and try to forego this, or try to forestall this possible eventuality and move in a diplomatic direction. So without any pressure on that, by the way, which is even with pressure, it would probably still fail. That's the crazy thing, which is that we are not even attempting at something that could give us the off-ramp. It's like we don't even want to see if it's a possibility. And by forestalling that, we're essentially ensuring that the path that we're on continues.
The longer we wait, the more steps of escalation that are taken by the Ukrainians, by us, by the Russians, the more difficult it becomes to bring this thing to any sort of a close. Right. Ceasefire, temporary peace deal, whatever it is. The further we go down this path, the more unlikely it is that we can form any sort of negotiation between the two sides. And to go back to what Panetta is saying here of, we should strike Russian forces in Ukraine and basically make sure that Russia is going to lose this war in Ukraine, and in the most maximalist way, pushing them out of the east, pushing them out of Crimea, where, before this war, it was widely acknowledged that Crimea basically wanted to be part of Russia. And this is a very, that part is incredibly important to Russia. So he's saying we're going to strike Russian troops in a way that will basically make it impossible for them to win this war. How do you think that Putin is going to perceive that? I mean, if that is not an existential threat to him and his power and his regime, I don't know what is. So yeah, what do you think the likely response to that is? And going back to that piece that we put up earlier from Jeremy Shapiro, War on the Rocks, this is actually exactly the escalatory chain that he lays out.
Right.
That is step 2. Step 1 is Putin uses tactical nuclear weapons in some way on the battlefield or even as a demonstration. Step 2 is literally this exact strategy, this exact thing that Leon Panetta is suggesting that we do. And he says that the next thing that is likely to happen is that they will see a direct NATO attack on Russia or Russian forces as confirmation of their view that the West intends to destroy the Russian regime and kill all of its leaders. They say for Russian leaders, this is an ever-present reality. Putin reportedly obsessively watches the video of Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi's death after he was overthrown by NATO forces. Facing the prospect of death if they do not act to save their regime, Russian leaders will risk launching further conventional and tactical nuclear strikes on NATO troop formations and Ukrainian supply operations in bordering NATO states like Poland and Estonia to signal that Russia is willing and able to defend itself despite the risk of strategic nuclear escalation. Yeah. So, and then you're off to the races. That is the way that this chain could unfold precisely. And again, none of that is, each step doesn't seem totally insane, but the place where you end up is literal global suicide. So these things that are being suggested by the supposedly, sober minds, the serious, the serious credentialed folks in DC are total insanity if you care about, the future of the globe. So the fact that you have, once again, this hawkish bipartisan consensus, and for all of, some of the rhetorical things Biden has said that I've appreciated, saying we don't want to get into World War III, sounding the alarm about nuclear Armageddon, some of the comments that he made to Tapper about, hey, I think Putin's a rational actor. The fact remains that the policy has been one of escalation, 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 and a total unwillingness to push Ukraine to sit down at the negotiating table.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the Ukrainians themselves, and look, this is an existential battle for them. They're actually preparing. Let's go and put this on the screen. Quote, some Ukrainians are bracing for the possibility of a Russian nuclear strike. Fears across the capital and more of severe retaliation grew after the attack on the bridge to Crimea. Now, they say, but U.S. officials have said they think the chances of Moscow's nuclear weapons use are slim, but they do quote officials inside of the Ukrainian government on background and more saying, look, there's not much we can do, but we are preparing for the reality. And despite Zelensky's initial pledge that, Putin is bluffing, they have since retracted that, both Zelensky himself and his military advisors saying, no, it actually very much could happen. Now, also, this is another thing. As I said, I actually went and read the national security strategy and found a very troubling line. Put this up there. Here is it, straight from the mouth of the U.S. military. They say, quote, Russia's conventional military will have been weakened, which will likely increase Moscow's reliance on nuclear weapons in its military planning. Effectively saying that the current situation on the battlefield for Moscow means that they are going to become more reliant on nuclear weapons, both strategic and tactical, in order to achieve their overall war aims, meaning that the likelihood of the strike is actually higher whenever you read this document. So that was another one that slipped out to me. And then finally, let's put this up there, which is from the Washington Post. Again, we're reading these former officials, private U.S. officials. Here's what they said, quote, privately, U.S. officials say that neither Russia nor Ukraine is capable of winning the war outright. They say they do not know what the end of the war looks like or how it might end or when, insisting that is up to Kyiv. Interesting. Huh, Krystal? And actually, there's more to that quote.
Yeah, so the full quote is that they say neither Russia nor Ukraine is capable of winning the war outright. And they have ruled out the idea of pushing or even nudging Ukraine to the negotiating table. So the official policy of the U.S. government is just continue on this path.
Yeah.
And as I think we've laid out in excruciating detail this morning, that path leads to total and complete disaster. So as much as we hear some, at least like aware of the dangers of the situation notes from President Biden, which is better than you can say for like 99% of the media, the path that they are on continues to be terrifying and one of escalation and one of not even being willing to nudge the Ukrainians towards the negotiating table. You have some other quotes in that piece that are also really interesting, troubling. They say all this adds up to a war that looks increasingly open-ended, as even those in Zelensky's inner circle most open to exploring negotiations with Russia said Putin's annexations marked a fatal blow. Quote, Putin injected the virus of infinite war with his annexation move, said a top negotiator for Zelensky and the majority leader of Ukraine's parliament in an interview. Ukraine will never accept this. That goes to the idea of what we've been saying, that the further you go along this path and the further steps of escalation, the more difficult it becomes to achieve any sort of ceasefire and end to this war. The piece about Ukrainians preparing for a potential nuclear attack, there were parts of that that really got to me because you have to remember, some of the people that they interviewed literally fled from the nuclear fallout from Chernobyl. Yeah. Like, this is a country that knows far too well what, the consequences of radiation and nuclear fallout could be. So this is like very visceral for significant parts of this population. And then they were talking about how some elementary schools have advised parents to put together an emergency pack for their little kiddos to have with them at school. One person who works in a market selling home goods said a mom came to her with a list from the school that included latex gloves, a poncho, boot covers, tissues, wet wipes, and a flashlight. As if that's going to do jack shit for you in a nuclear war. But that's where they are, trying to hold on to any idea that, that they could ultimately get through this. And that really brought it home for me, what an absolutely terrifying situation and how incredibly real this is right now.
I think you're right, Krystal. I take solace in the fact that I live close enough to the Pentagon that I will be vaporized in the event of a nuclear strike.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.